Hello, everyone. Yes. Okay, so we're here. We've reached the summit. 2 weeks in. Software Factory.
Crazy.
Yes, welcome back, everyone. How's it going, Zach? How are you?
Very good. Very good. Very pumped about this.
Yes, so we are at the final day of the 2 weeks of our Software Factory series. So what we're going to do today is a recap, a debrief, a bit of a retrospective. Zach's going to run us through his learnings, some metrics. We're going to dig into the product and have a look at what we've actually created over the course of the 2 weeks. If you haven't caught any of the other sessions, I'm hoping that this one's a great one because we're going to go through everything, really, like a real high level overview of everything we've done. And then you can always go back and deep dive on specific episodes if you want to go into more detail on certain aspects. But quickly, before I hand over to Zach, and he's going to run us through the actual product that we've been building here, but I just want to go back all the way to the start and just recap actually on what the goals were. Like, why are we doing this in the first place? Why are we even building this software factory in public? And what's the whole thing for? So the main thing is, one is to really prove that software factories are here. They exist, and you can automate them across every step of the software lifecycle: planning, review, right up to operations, to bug fixing, etc. The full software development lifecycle. Now, the goal was not to say this is how we think we should build every application today. It's rather to say that as you are applying agents into your own product, into your own lifecycle, we've shown different ways that you can do that across the entirety of the software development lifecycle. So wherever your bottlenecks are in your organization or on any products that you're building, you can apply these principles. And I believe actually as an industry, we're already doing it. Everyone's already building some version of this software factory, whether they call it a software factory or not. And what we want to do is push everything to the extreme and show what was possible and do it all in public as well. Because one common question, especially with this type of thing, is like, what does the code look like? What is the quality? And it's all there in public. You've got the repo, you've got the automations, everything that you need to see is all there in public, which has been super cool and has been quite an interesting journey. So that was what we tried to achieve with it. You let us know in the comments and drop us some questions if you think we have achieved that, or if there's anything that we've not covered, because we can certainly do a similar series also in future and touch on some other points. But is there anything I missed there, Zach, that you would add to that?
Or... I think pretty much sums it up. Maybe we should show the product to those who haven't tried it out yet. So
I hadn't actually played with it in quite a while, and the thing is, I'll let you run in through it in a second, Zach, but like, it's deep. There's like lots of features in here, so it'd be great to kind of show some of that. It actually goes a lot deeper than it looks on the surface. So anyway, over to you.
Super cool, right? I mean, UI is minimal. That was the outset, given that we were kind of taking a lot of inspiration from Notion, a tool that most people will be familiar with. We've got basically the view here of your landing page when you log into your workspace. If you recently visited Pages, your all pages with a filter, and then obviously kind of familiar layout with like a sidebar where you can pin your favorite pages. You can create new pages. We've added databases this week. I think a really cool feature that we added this week as well was the feedback. So in-app feedback for any bugs, any ideas, with automatic screenshots that are captured for feedback. You can obviously label it bug feature general, tell us the message. And that is linked to one of our automations, which I think is great. So we have a digest that comes in every hour at the moment with any kind of feedback that is being captured from users. And we can action that directly from the Slack channel with Ona, which is pretty cool, I would say. At least I think so. Then for those of you who have seen the interface, you might be surprised that it's all a little bit light now. So we've added dark mode, with basically a few minutes to spare and going into this, which was great, seeing the issue for dark mode being raised, that being reflected both in Storybook as well as in the production UI. And I actually think it looks quite nice.
Dark mode means that we've MVP is achieved now. The final feature.
I mean, that's an interesting one, right? Because in the original spec, dark mode, light mode, switching was out of spec, out of scope. And when you add an out of scope feature, you actually see the agent going in and flagging it to you that it needs additional approval to implement it, because it will check against the product scope and say, hey, light mode is out of scope. Do you actually want to implement that? And it flags it on GitHub in the issues, so you can actually see when you go into the repo that the agent says, okay, I need additional confirmation to implement this. And I quite like
For the features, Zach, I know you might have touched on this at a previous point. Did you do the spec once at the start and just run through, or did you did you adjust the spec, adding sort of specific features or anything like that, or was it like
Yes. So at the beginning, we had a base spec for week 1. So that was setting up the workspace, making sure that we have an editor with the regular pages, so we can set up, go in. You have a page, you can give it a title. You have your different blocks that you want to add, the ability to insert images, to be able to share a page, import Markdown, export Markdown. So all these like features that make an editor actually useful.
I love this slash command, by the way, as well, because there's so many of these. Like, it's done like quotes and bullets and nested tables and data.
It's quite nice. I think the only one that's really missing is font sizes, not font sizes, but different fonts. So we can switch that. But I mean, that is something that we could add to the floating menu here, because right now you can only do bold, italic, underline, strike through, all the font types that you want. And I think right now this is my only limitation. I would say, okay, this would be a nice addition and enhancement to add different font types here and typefaces. But yeah, back to your question. Basically, in the first week, we wanted to just show that the factory can build, and it can build towards the spec. And then it ran through, I think, the initial spec from Wednesday to Friday. And on Friday, at the end of the day, it had run through the spec. Didn't have much to do so over the weekend. It already went into a self-improvement loop. And it kind of reviewed, okay, what is our spec? And the spec, to an extent, was intentionally not super detailed. And it was interesting to see what it actually went up doing, adding things like adding a cover, adding an icon, which was not specifically stated, but it actually went in to do research what Notion would look like, or what features Notion has, and identify gaps to come to this product, and then added some of the functionality here as well as, and also identified that a lot of the components didn't have tests, so it started writing tests as well when it didn't have anything to do. And then on Monday, at the end of the day, I added something to the spec, which was the database. So a core feature, for example, of Notion is databases, and that was not in original spec. And I wanted to see, okay, how easy is it to extend the spec and also add new features? Because compared to, for example, the feedback or a light mode, adding something like the databases is a quite big feature, requiring a lot of planning and breaking down interdependencies between the steps that you're building. And that was done, in this case, with the owner interface going into the plan mode and having it decompose this feature. And then you can see when you go into the repo at the beginning of the week, there were a lot of feature issues raised by the agent. And then that went into our normal loop. And I can go into that later. Just let me show that for a second. Basically, that went into our loop then from like planning, building, reviewing, deployment, and operating. But we'll jump into that in a second after we finish the walkthrough and show you what else the product can do. So naturally, we have databases. We added a couple of different views to the databases to just make this complete. We added data types.
This is quite crazy to me. Like, databases in Notion are quite complicated. Like, this is not.
They are. Yeah.
This is not stereotypical UI elements. It's quite a lot of layers to this. It's kind of creating subpages, and I presume under the hood, I haven't looked, but I imagine it might have to like go through a lot of different libraries here as well to get the calendar view and things like that.
Yeah,
it's actually a lot more intricate than I expected. Yeah,
and I think obviously, I think a caveat here is looking at performance. There's already been since yesterday, a little bit of work going into how we can make the performance a bit better, improve loading times, use caching a bit better. But that's naturally, I think, one thing that you would have to go and iterate a lot more on. And the team at Notion, I'm sure, has spent more than a week or two designing their data structure and the tooling that goes around making everything snappy. And I think right now I'm pretty happy with the performance. But this is probably an area to improve on, and making sure that we have faster loading times and better UX speeds. But given the complexity of a feature like that, where you have the sub pages and you have custom attributes and everything is kind of like a block in itself, it is something that spirals out quite fast. So for a product that was built in such a short time frame, I think it's really, really cool to see where we've gotten to already. And yeah, basically this self-improvement loop is something that you probably never get to 100%, and you can always find something to improve on. But I think for the initial feature set, it's really cool to see, what you can do. We can embed the databases that you create in your pages. You can add, your cover images, your emojis for your pages. Add context. You can also manage your workspace settings. So I can invite you to my workspace quite easily with a link. But you should have something in your inbox now. But I can also just send you this link, and you can sign up. You go into my workspace, and then it's a shared workspace. So those are really the things that make this product experience feel quite nice, and where I'm just super impressed by going from a spec that was done in like a short time to a product that already feels more than just an MVP. It's quite amazing. I think from like the feature set, let me think. Is there anything important? I mean, search I think is fundamental. You want to have some kind of search, so you can obviously in my test pages there's not that much to see, not too many pages, but the search works across all the content that you upload. So really, I think in terms of functionality, there is a lot here already, a lot of complexity that the factory has built itself, and that's just really, really cool to see.
Yeah, it's nice to run through, because I think when I was looking at the sort of lines of code and the size of the application, I was kind of wondering, scratching my head a little bit. I was wondering, hey, like, did this match up? But actually, then when you dig into it, right, like, it has the admin features, the back office stuff, inviting members to the application, like, and there's a lot of depth to the UI, like Notion actually, where Notion seems simple on the surface, but then you start to realize, oh my god, like these slash commands and these sub UIs and etc. And there's actually like a lot more complexity to it under the hood. So
like these small things,
the drag and drop stuff is wild as well. Yeah, and also in the sidebar.
I mean that's quite cool. So if you haven't seen that, you can obviously drag your pages, you can unnest them. It's you can nest them even more, and that's quite cool. And so those are all like the small bits and pieces that makes it quite complex. Yeah, that's quite cool. I mean, like you already said it on the metrics, right? Maybe we can quickly share that.
Let's jump to that.
Prepared a little dashboard, right? And I think it's quite cool to see where we've gone through almost 400 commits, 375 PRs merged, pretty much autonomously, right? We have a metric down here that shows you how many PRs percentage-wise were done completely without a human in the loop. And we are at the moment, I think, around 88% of PRs completely done by agents. And that means around 12% were either triggered by a human, in that case, me, going into Ona saying, okay, here's something that I want to fix or something I want to add. That obviously also includes the initial setup, but also anything where the agent went into or hit a wall and requested human support. So that's something where you then sometimes have to go into and give more guidance or resolve a merge conflict manually. I think the ratio is pretty good with like almost 90% to 10%.
For the test stack, like how much of that were you opinionated on? Like how much were you specifying, I don't know, like types of tests or best practices, or did you?
And we can see here that like at the beginning, it was completely unopinionated, and then towards around April 20th, I actually went in and I instructed it to write more tests. I haven't instructed too much. I wanted to make sure that we have more end-to-end tests, but we also have unit tests. Obviously, on unit tests, it's always like there's a lot to write. But we had a lot of regressions kind of after week one, where I saw, okay, there were a lot of bugs kind of coming back, and that was the root cause because we didn't have enough testing going on. So that was one of the improvements that we did, and we see obviously regressions become less as tests grow. Obviously, your tests then lead to more loops in the review versus build phase, and the reviewer says, okay, there's more to fix here, but ultimately the quality of the product becomes a lot better. And we also see that in the amount of lines of code, right? So it's actually around 63 now. 53 is the actual code base, and then we have a lot of code that goes into the tests and the database migrations as well. The number of issues is quite good. I think the number of issues is actually not that important, but the median time for closing, from opening an issue to closing, 38 minutes as a median is pretty strong. So you have to think about it like a lot of these issues are obviously opened by an agent without human intervention. So whenever there's a bug or there's a regression that the factory notices itself, it actually opens an issue and closes it itself. And I would say, especially on the weekends or in the evenings when the team might not be on it, like during the day, this is amazing to see that within 40 minutes you can solve most of the issues that are coming up. Yeah, I mean, if we look at the number of commits, it's been quite steady. We had obviously for the database feature, and it also shows how much complexity goes, for example, into the database feature around earlier this week when we edited. We saw a lot went into, and you can really see that, for example, also in the lines of code. That is, naturally the feature is complex, but then also all the tests that you want to write for the feature are complex. I also find it quite interesting to see the issues open versus close. It looks quite good. You can see here that there was some features, the database, which was quite complex, that also adds your time between closing versus opening. So we had a few that have taken, I think, over a couple of hours. But if we look at the time to close, we see that only very few have taken like more than 4 hours to really work on. But that's the amazing thing, kind of looking at this factory, and you see that there are some long-running tasks, right? This is not basically a mechanism or a process that only picks up easy stuff and then fixes it. But you can also really have complex features that take a lot of time run in this factory, and it doesn't block any other work, right? So naturally, depending on what it's working on, for example, if it's working on a P1 bug, it will not continue with any other work. So we'll focus on fixing any of that. But for example, if we have features that are implemented, if they're not having any other dependency, it will continue work on other features that are open and in the backlog. So that's, I think, quite cool to see as well. Let me think. Yeah, I mean, the other metrics, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. I like our CI pass ratio. It's consistently over 90%. Today was a bit low on 94. That was probably to do with some of the changes on the UI and a little bit of manual work. But overall, being, I think, on average at 98% is pretty strong as well. Yeah, I think that is pretty much it for this dashboard. So you will find those metrics as well on our website in the next few days. I think that's quite nice, because this will also be live maintained. So as the factory goes along, we will maintain this. Well, I say we, but it's the factory itself maintaining this dashboard, which is another cool thing, right? Those are all the things that you start having autonomously running, and really, have this loop that goes around. And I think, speaking about loops, we can maybe look at the map of our process and different automations. So we've shown a version of this over the last few streams already. So this will also be for you to click into, and we really see the different stages of the SDLC that we've built out. And I think the interesting one to think about here is, while we've tried to capture the SDLC for our factory building a product, ultimately what we had to do for the factory is use a similar process to think about how we can actually build our factory. Because while the factory built Memo, our product was actually the factory. And also for me, the last 2 weeks, I think that was the biggest learning here. Is my job was obviously looking at Memo and looking at the UI, the look and feel, making sure that it works. But the actual input went into the factory, and making sure the factory works, and making sure that the factory produces good output. And all the bug fixes were actually not on Memo, but they were on the factory, right? So for me, this feedback loop from operating to planning was very much focused on the factory, and that was really, really cool to see.
Yeah, I suppose I'll jump in as well, Zach, and just to clarify those that didn't follow along before as well. Like, so an automation, at least within Owner, so we've used Owner to build this out, and an automation is almost like an individual agent that's running its own environment. So all of these individual automations don't run on Zach's machine. They run on a schedule or in response to a trigger or something like this, and they're running in the background. And in each of those is sort of individually prompted, but when it starts up, it has access to all of the source code, the application, etc. But then it's doing a different piece of the puzzle. So I'm sure if you continue this, you build out this factory more and more, I almost imagine you get a seriously increased amount of these automations as you start to get more specific about certain aspects, or you get more complicated and add more of those in. But I just wanted to clarify that. One thing that did stand out to me, Zach, actually, I would love your opinion on it. Is there a reason that sort of the operational side and the planning side is like heavily, there's more automations there? Like, the thing that comes to my mind is obviously when we think about software factory, like one of the most important things is like building that feedback for the agent. Do you think that that's kind of why, or is there, it's almost like the build and review bit, which I would have almost thought would be the more complicated bit, has fewer automations?
I actually think it's because the building and reviewing is almost the easy part of it, right? Because if we look at agentic development, what we've seen, agents are really good at just building code. This is not the bottleneck typically. You can, nowadays with the latest models, throw a really complicated problem at an agent or at a model, and you will get typically a pretty good output. And same for review. If you let an agent review your code, you will typically get a somewhat qualitative output and assessment of your code base. So the overall amount of automations that we need to cover those two steps is fairly low. It is also the fact that for our builder and our reviewer, there's a lot going on within the prompt, and we can click into it. We can see a few things that do a lot of different tasks, and you could decompose those into individual automations. But given the ability of the agents, there's a lot bundled into individual automations. So, for example, the feature builder, has a couple of options depending on how much backlog there is. It chooses, the kind of prompt that it will follow, and the task really depends on the current state of the backlog. And same with the reviewer and the shepherd, which is a secondary loop, making sure that our reviewer goes through it. But these two automations, they kind of like go in sync, right? And they go back and forth. So there is not that much to do in terms of volume. Volume, they have a lot of volume, but we don't need many automations to cover these two steps. I think the reason why planning and operating have more automations is because there's a lot of edge cases and a lot of different things that are going on in these two phases. And depending on your product, depending on your user base, depending on the step in your planning or operating life cycle, there are different things that you want to keep an eye on, right? Like if you look at operations, we have a few different, two different automations looking at verification. That whenever we have something merge in production, that the production still works. We have a UI verify, and again, we could bundle them together, but in this case, they really serve different purposes, which is why they're separate. And we have our incident responder, which just monitors our logs on Sentry and then feeds back into the planning if there's something broken. So I think if you really look at it from that perspective, it's just about what are you trying to do and where sits the complexity within the life cycle. And as complex as building and reviewing is, it is steps that are somewhat self-contained, and they don't really follow too many edge cases in that sense.
Yeah, amazing. Could we? So we've got the sort of the full picture here as well, Zach. Is it possible that you can maybe take us into one of them? I don't know if you have anything up on your side that you could maybe run us through with like one of the specific automations, and maybe we can go a little bit deeper into just quickly just looking at how maybe that like sort of works in practice, or you could talk us through how maybe one of the more interesting ones here is implemented.
Yeah, if you absolutely want. I will quickly just jump into GitHub. So my favorite one is the bug fixer. I love the bug fix automation just because it works extremely well. Just to jump back into quickly the workflow, tell you how the bug fixer works. basically two options. One is the automated bug fixing coming out of the incident response. So whenever we have a bug coming through Sentry, the incident responder will pick it up, will assess it, triage it, and if it's a verified bug, it will open an issue that the bug fixer then will pick up. And the other option is that a bug is reported by a user or by us, either through owner interface directly or through GitHub issues. And then we will see a list of bugs. So just walking through the current issue list right now, you will see a couple of enhancements. You will see one bug currently, which is in review. And this is basically what the bug fixer then goes into. It looks at the bug, it picks it up, and then maybe we go into the code itself, because you won't be able to see much on here. Let me just...
It's worth just reiterating as well for folks, right? So if you go to software-factory.dev, you can also have a link through to this memo repo. And if you want to pull it up on your side, you can do as well, and have a look at all these automations that Zach has actually defined. And you can see then the full prompts. So also just for reference, because it might not be super easy to see, but like inside of the .owner file, there's an automations folder, and inside of that folder is all of the YAMLs for everything that Zach has just shown, and all of the prompts as well. So if anyone's on their laptop and wants to follow along, you can do that as well and have a dig around. I am also behind the scenes. Having looked through these prompts is kind of interesting.
No, I mean, like the prompt is quite interesting, because it just shows you, the logic that goes into fixing the bug. It obviously reviews if there's something that's reoccurring, what kind of bug it is, if it can fix it itself, the way it needs to approach the bug fixing itself. And then obviously updating the knowledge base whenever we deploy a fix, that is longer term or actually structural. It's instructed to also update our knowledge base, our conventions, etc., and then to create a PR according to our conventions as well, right? So we usually, with anything that's agentic, require it to close an issue. So there needs to be an issue for the PR to close as well. And it also instructs it what to do in terms of failure. So this is, I think, also important. If it hits a wall, then it typically asks for needs human. If there's any other issues, we've seen it works quite well to get those edge cases. And I mean, if we look into the automation log on owner itself, we can actually see, there's a long list of bugs and automations that have run through fixing bugs. So in this case, for example, it's also interesting. We see that one of the schedules or the assessments failed. This is an interesting one, because the way it's now set up is we will see that in one of the other automations being picked up as a stale issue, and that will automatically be triggered into backlog again. So the work that this failed automation has done then will be fixed by a future run of this automation as well.
We should probably in future as well, Zach. It's interesting, because as I read through some of these prompts, like you show your STLC workflow, but each agent itself almost has it's quite an intricate workflow, frankly, inside of it. You're checking the dev environment. If not, then exiting, raising an issue for that. You're then checking if the issue is raised. If not, then you're doing this. So there really is quite an intricate, almost like dependency tree within these as well. It's quite interesting actually. Even at the bug fixing one, right? I can see there's explicit sort of parts where you've put the human in the loop as well, right? Where you've asked it, okay, if you reach this point and you can't solve it, escalate to me, add the needs humans. That's really interesting to see.
That's true. I mean, we've seen here, right? We have 2 touch points for humans. It's obviously in the planning stage as well as in the building stage. But one thing that this diagram doesn't show is exactly what you said, the interlinking between the individual automations just yet. But they obviously depend heavily on each other. They flag certain things to to each other. For example, a feature builder to the PR reviewer, the bug fixer to humans, bug fixer to the planner.
And it's interesting as well, because also as I'm looking here, you've got the CLI for a GitHub, right? So your engine of state is GitHub basically.
Yeah.
For some of these issues and things, but then because that environment has access to GitHub, it can run the CLI, and because it's authenticated, etc., it has access to that. So that's really quite interesting to see, actually, quite how far you can push this, also just by using existing CLIs, because I can see a lot of workflow here where you're saying, if this label is not raised, etc., pass through this gate, etc. So it's actually quite interesting to see how far you've got with CLIs, authenticated CLIs, and access to something like GitHub in order to be effectively a state manager for the factory itself.
Which was also a design decision. I think that's worth noting, because if you look at, for example, a lot of the harnessing that's going on, there's a lot of different harness approaches that keep everything in Markdown files in the repo, and that is something you can do, and it works pretty well. I have some projects that work like that as well. But in this case of the factory, given that we were already working with GitHub as kind of the engine, it was part of the design decision to not duplicate it, because otherwise, where's your source of truth? And you always have, no matter how good your prompt is, the risk that if you add something at the end of the prompt, it will be skipped. And especially with updating documentation, I've seen this happening early on, that the documentation is not always in sync. That in this case, I said it makes sense to just use GitHub as the source for truth, and always use GitHub, for all the issues that are in progress. For everything that's done, you can just query GitHub and look at the issue list, rather than having the Markdown file that tells you, okay, what's in progress, what's in backlog. And that's the direction. We obviously still heavily rely on the repo itself, and we have our convention documents and our architecture or initial product spec all in the Markdown file, and we also spec it against it and mark what's done and what's still to do. But the source of truth of the state still maintains your list in GitHub of the issues, which is also important, I think, for something that we just added today, is the product improver, which is another feedback loop, just purely focusing on UI and UX improvements, just looking what are issues that have come up before, how can we solve these going forward, and that also is instructed to go into the list, look at any kind of regressions that we had in the past, and it helps to have this just list of issues that we had. That, together with the automations auditor, I think are the two most important automations that we'll have going forward, to make sure that the factory is starting to self-improve and really going into a way where it becomes better and better at what it does, and also ships even better on the product quality side.
Amazing. Is there anything else, Zach, from your side with regards to the automations that you think is worth touching on? Because I have also a set of questions here that I'm curious to get your input on in your sort of reflections on the last 2 weeks as well.
I think generally, if we look at the automations, the important part is this is not the template, and this is the way to do it. There is a lot of changes that you can do in terms of the prompting, and I think if this continues to run, especially with the improvement loops, we will see a lot of changes in the prompts as well. And there's also depending on the state of the repo, you might have different prompts as your product matures, just because it makes sense to shift the focus. For example, when you start greenfield versus now maintaining a fully developed product. I think that's the only thing that's really worth mentioning. And again, there can be design choices in terms of automations that you want to combine or separate. But I think the important thing is to mention that you will ultimately have automations kind of capturing each step of the SDLC in some way, shape, or form.
Do you think, given enough time, do you feel like you have an idea of sort of roughly what size of automation? Are these automations going to get smaller? Are you going to end up making these smaller? And then, did you get a feel, an intuitive sense of how much logic makes sense to kind of bundle into one of these? Because I assume at the start you have a few, now you've made a few more, broken out a few bits. Let's say if we gave you 6 months, you were building this out further. Do you think it would still say in this region of sort of 15, or you would have 50 or 100 or this kind of thing?
I think the amount right now, it's 14 actually maintaining the code base, and then I think 2, 3 that are just helping us with the operational side, the metrics, etc. I think the number is a pretty good spot. I don't think you want to go to 100 different automations. I don't see, especially for the product as it is right now, that there is a lot of advantage doing that. I think looking at the state of the models that we use under the hood, they are becoming better. So if anything, I think it might even shrink in terms of numbers of automations, and it might go to a model where you have a quite general automation and then sub agents coming out of that automation. But I don't think we're going to a place where you'll have like hundreds of automations, each dealing with like something very specific, unless maybe your product is such a big code base that you might require some more specialized automations. But then again, I would probably say you can solve that with documentation and skills.
Yeah, exactly. And I know if you speak to anyone that's like close to the models or the labs, they're going to talk about like the bitter lesson and sort of say, and they're right that, if you looked at how AI engineering looked a year or so ago, there was a lot more harness engineering you had to do around the LLM. So it's quite possible, as you say, that over time, fewer of these automations are required as the models get stronger, and you have to be less prescriptive with certain parts of it. So I would be curious then, Zach, I got a couple of questions then. If we sort of reflect back on this, so you've spent 2 weeks building out the software factory. In fact, there was one other question before I get into this as well, which has also been, how much time per day did you spend roughly on this? Because we say 2 weeks, but I'm actually kind of curious, like how much time did you spend as an operator kind of building this? Because it wasn't necessarily 8 hours a day, a full day per se, was it? But how much time did you roughly spend? Sort of
I think
tending to the
on building, it really depended. The first few days, quite a few hours, because there was nothing set up yet. So you spend a lot of time kind of product building, but not, as I said earlier, you don't build Memo, you build a factory to build Memo. And then I think over the time of the 2 weeks, like it just tapered off. So I was able to shift more into looking at our metrics, looking at reporting, looking at documentation. So yeah, I would say like at the beginning it was pretty much a couple of hours, probably like anywhere from 8 to 10 hours a day, just like setting up the factory, and then like it tapered off quite steeply, which is quite nice to see.
Yeah. So then coming into this, right? So if you think back to how you came into this, did your sort of mental model of a software factory change at all? Did you come into this having a perception of how this was going to work that maybe didn't, or did it kind of like work out as you imagined? Is your mental model now different for a software factory or similar to as you started out with?
I think it's probably similar. The thing that changed was probably to see how much actually goes into the operating step. And this is what you said earlier, right? If we look at the amount of automations going into operations and planning, I did not expect that to be the case. But that is something I learned as we build this product. Okay, if we want to have a proper self improvement loop, you need to monitor the operational side and ensure that your planning is to a high quality. And I think also looking at it from the perspective that I think planning, especially on the product spec side, was not super in depth. And that's something that kind of came around at the end of week 1 and kind of early week 2, when we had the first users starting to use the product and saying, okay, there's a couple of bugs. And I would say, yes, there were bugs, but they were probably just shortcoming in your initial product spec. If the spec had been more detailed, those bugs probably wouldn't have shipped in production because they were just not mentioned. So that's, I think, something where if I now think of the factory, it just comes back to the point you need to spend some time speccing out the product. The more precise you are with what you want, the better your outcome is. But I think this is also something that is just the norm with LLMs and agentic coding. The more precise you can actually communicate what you want, the better your outcome will be from the code.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in one of the episodes, I think we dug into a bit of planning, right? Also, probably with Matt, maybe, maybe with Chris as well. Yeah, one of my questions. This is one of the ones I'm quite curious about as well. Like, if you were to start over, is there anything you'd kind of do differently? Like now, knowing what you know, having this experience, setting up all these automations? Would you do anything differently? Would you start at a different point? Would you, maybe tackle these sort of the automation aspects in a different way? Or
I think I would focus more on the improvement loop. So the automation auditor, for example, we only activated after week 1. I think I would start it a little bit earlier. I still think it's not worth putting it, on day 1 or day 2 if you don't have the factory set up yet. But as soon as you have the basic set of automations running, it doesn't hurt to have the automation auditor giving you recommendations on where to improve on next. And I also think something like the product improver is something I would set up much earlier, to just have a pulse check on where our factory thinks it can improve the product, and ultimately also improve the factory itself. Because I think you can set up the automations now, you can take the blueprint, but you really want to see if it's working for what you're building, if it's working with the tooling that you use, for example, Sentry, etc. I would just make sure that any kind of exceptions always get surfaced, that you don't swallow any errors, any logs, because the more data you capture and the more you can actually observe, the better the self-improvement loop will be. And I think the other thing is, as I just said, planning. When it comes to giving the factory a spec of a product that you want, spend a bit more time on setting that up, thinking about the product feel, especially also the UI. Right at the beginning, we had the design spec sheet, and that worked, I think, reasonably well. But once we added Storybook at the beginning of this week, the UI just became a bit more crisp, and also makes it easier to align, and much faster to actually get an output without having to go into the UI, looking at it, and then saying, hey, we need to change the spec sheet. But you can actually design this a bit better from the first place and get a faster output iteration.
Amazing, super cool. So then, as we look forward, what do you think is next? Really, what is next for the industry? What is next for software factories? What is next for, I don't know, how you maybe approach how you build things in future?
I mean, I think for the industry, kind of comes down to what you said yesterday. Right, everyone is building their own factories right now. I don't think that's necessarily how it's going to work in the future, because there's just a lot of duplication of the same kind of work. I think there's going to be some kind of standardization coming in, and standardized ways of shipping factories are becoming the norm. The question is still like, what's the best tooling? It's still a big question mark. I think for me personally, this experiment has really changed the way I think about building products, and I would love to push all my projects onto like a factory setup, especially this loop of operating to planning, where you have observability, you have any kind of issues being raised and flagged and fixed automatically, just close by the factory, is amazing. And I think personally this will be where I'm going to spend the next few weeks, just looking at any kind of work that I'm doing to make sure we have this automation loop set up to enable me personally to focus more on product rather than on fixing any kind of bugs that are in my products.
Amazing, super cool. So I think we are closing in on time, so maybe we can start to wrap things up there. Is there anything else, Zach, that you think that's worth mentioning? What I should say as well, I suppose, is if people don't know this as well, is like, with the automations and with Owner, like, you can also go and try this. You can literally just go and sign into Owner and actually build your own automations. You can build a software factory however you want, but if you want to build it the same way or in a similar way that Zach did, you can actually just go and try it. It's entirely available. You just log in. You get some free credits when you start out, and then you can just get cooking with the automations and actually start building out your own software factory. But I don't know, Zach, was there anything else that I had missed about this? I do want to give a quick shout out to the virtual summit that we're running soon. But just before we wrap up and jump onto that, is there anything else?
I think the only thing about automations, and you just mentioned it already, you can just start building automations, is to build a factory. You don't need to build the entire process, right? You can start obviously greenfield, makes your life a lot easier. So if you're starting a new project, if you have any ideas, start with it in mind to set up the end-to-end flow. But if you have a product that you're currently running and you want to automate your PR reviews, you want to just have your monitoring automated. Just focus on one step of the process that takes a lot of time for you, or you don't really enjoy doing somewhat manually. I mean, I don't think most people work manually anymore. There's always some kind of agent loop here, but there is a lot of customization that you can do with the automations and the factory setup. So what I would say the best thing to do right now is start experimenting how this can be adapted into your workflow, because I do believe this is the future of product development and software engineering.
Amazing, super cool. So I want to give a quick shout out, if I may. I'll just throw something up on my screen. So for those that, if you've been following along to what we've been building here with the Software Factory, it's almost undoubtedly that you're interested or curious about the concept of background agents. So we did actually, in fact, if I go here, we released a microsite a couple of months ago, maybe 2 months ago now, which basically sort of talks about what a background agent is and what's going on here and what the future of the SDLC might be. You should definitely go and check that out. But one thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is actually we're now running a summit. So you can find this at background-agents.com/summit, which I'll just bring up here for you. And we've got a bunch of different speakers from a number of different companies. So some implementers of their own background agents, names that you might have heard of or seen some of their implementations, like Stripe and Harvey. But we're adding a number of these still. Actually, the CFP is still open until Sunday this week, and we'll be running that on the 6th of May. So do come along to that. You can sign up actually on that page for the Background Agent Summit. And do also let us know, let me know. I would love to know what are the topics that you think are interesting, because we're still curating the agenda. There's still time for us to tweak it a little bit, but you can have a look on there. You can see who's speaking and the topics. Things are coming out all throughout the rest of this week. There'll be some more changes that we'll be making, some more announcements to additional speakers. But I think if you're interested in software factories, you'll be very interested in this. So this is really first of its kind, really focusing on how software engineering changes with agents and trying to get into the details of this from the engineering side. So what infrastructure, what tools, what things do you need in place in order to do this? But then also from a security side, big aspect of it as well. How do you secure these agents? How do you give them this autonomy in a professional way? Because a lot of stuff we've shown here, obviously, if you wanted to run this in a professional environment, you need to start thinking about how do you secure all of this? How do you make sure these agents are operating autonomously, but also with control as well, especially if you work for a large sort of regulated company or an enterprise, things like that. And the final bit is also leadership, because again, if you work for a big company, you're going to have to roll out these tools. You're going to have to adopt them in some way. So we're going to have a number of different talks as well, speaking also from the adoption journeys and things like that as well. So do come along to that. And like I said, it's background-agents.com/summit. So we would love to see you there. And also Zach will be speaking. Zach's on the agenda. So he'll be breaking down some of the stuff here from the Software Factory learnings and giving a little bit of a talk there as well. So you'll see Zach again. But yeah, that's one thing I just wanted to give a quick shout out to. And then, yeah, Zach, is there any final words you want to drop? Or
pretty much, I think sums it up. Maybe a question for you: what was your favorite part of the Software Factory, or maybe like the biggest surprise for you?
So first of all, I was interested that you went with the no code review approach, not gonna lie. So I have found not my limit, but something that for me is like, that's really like something I find hard to let go of. So something that I'm thinking a lot about now is I'm fully on board with the idea of the Software Factory. I'm just also now spending a lot of time thinking about how that impacts code review. That's one thing I think that's really interesting aspect of what you did. But the other thing is, it's also just been great to have this in public. Frankly, I've been talking about software factories for a while, and many people have told me it's like a little bit frustrating that we talk a lot about these workflows, but there isn't necessarily something, people yearn for the details. So what I really like here is that we have that. I was at a conference day before yesterday, and it was just super cool to be able to point them to the code base and just say, like, this is how we've implemented it. And like the conversation we had with Shardul yesterday from AWS, interesting to see his definition of software factory, quite different, monolithic, storing all the state inside of the file system. But he also, we spoke yesterday off the stream, and he talked me through some different patterns of how you could implement sort of software factories using different primitives from AWS. So that's really interesting to see different patterns for this. And actually, one of the things is, so Steve Yegg actually, created Gastown, which is kind of like one of the, in January when he announced that, but he's also released a new thing now, which is like an SDK around Gastown, which is something we touched on briefly as part of the series. Like, will there be abstraction for software factories? It seems like Steve Yegg is also working a little bit on that, and I think that will continue. And that's something that I'm really curious about in the future, is how does the community start to rally around these different pieces of the puzzle for a software factory? But yeah, it's been really cool. It's great that it's in the open. I'm actually very excited to do something similar like this again. So would love people's feedback if they found this useful, what aspects they like, and then we can maybe do also another series or something similar. But yes, and also a massive thank you to Zach. 2 weeks every day, being here streaming. So, you know,
it's a lot of fun, a lot of learnings. I mean, and yeah, what you just said, right? It kind of shows there's a lot of flexibility in the way you set it up. I think code review is probably the one thing. If you go into production, you will not completely automate. Obviously, in our case, Greenfield, we want to go as fast as possible, having the agent do its own code review. And, naturally, it's a different agent doing a scrutinized code review on the code. There is a loop, and we can see it in the repo that there was like back and forth between reviewer and builder. But naturally, you could always say, okay, you never merge without manual code review. It's a very easy thing to implement, and shows that you can adapt it very much to any kind of workflow.
Amazing. Cool. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Another final reminder, software-factory.dev is where you can find all of this. If you want to go back to look at the previous streams, I think that's the best place to look for, isn't it, Zach, really? That's where you can 100%. Get all the information. And also, I think next week we will also make a few more final updates to that webpage as well, to point some resources and things like that. So
exactly. So you'll find everything that you need to know about the software factory there. Feel free to try the memo product if you haven't gotten a chance to do it already. It will stay online, so you can give it a spin. And again, also the feedback will stay open. So if you have any kind of reviews, any bugs that you find, you can continue shipping them to us, and we'll try to ship the improvements.
Awesome. Thank you very much. See everyone later.
Cheers. Bye.